welcome everybody. Welcome to Sanphar program. So today we are together 130 persons registered representing 20 countries. So thank you for your time and your presence. So our objective is to bring you biosecurity closer and alive to your operations. So therefore, biosecurity reinforce and hopefully securing your business continuity. So the program is made of 9 session webinar, short, 30 minutes on a monthly basis to bring you biosecurity best practices. Okay, and to achieve that, we have invited the best in class from the veterinary faculty of Ghent in university in Belgium, who has been, by the way, nominated the best faculty for the last 4 years in a row. The Department of Epidemiology is led by Professor Joran de Wolf. He has spent 20 years in prevention disease field with a focus of application of biosecurity. He has published a book on that and also on reduction of antibiotic usage. Joran actually last month took care of the 5 principles of biosecurity. So right now, I would like to spend a few minutes to go for, not a few minutes, 5 minutes for a quiz for you. Okay, so you remember we went through the 5 principles. So number 1, anyone? Okay, let me go first. So separate infectious and susceptible animals. Okay, number 2, not every measure is equally important. And number 3, reduce the general infection pressure. So diseases pressure down, and the size and the frequency matter. So this was the 5 principles that we went through last month with Joran. Okay, so I believe that all of us we passed. So in the team, Joran is assisted by a few people. So Dr. Nole Kakebeker, since 2017, has been very involved around antimicrobial usage reduction, and she's in charge of the training of the international public. She's part of the team of the Biosec team. And by the way, Nele kicked off the whole program of biosecurity in January. Okay. In the team, we have also Andy, and Andy is new to the team and new also to the session, so he will be with us today. So he's the contributor in the development of the e-learning module of the biosecurity. And the last member of this team to bring you the biosecurity program is Plamen Nikolov from Vilofos. So Plamen is a field specialist from Vilofos, and he brings more than 20 years of experience in animal health, nutrition, biosecurity, of course, with lots of experience, field experience worldwide. Okay, so the role of Plamen is to share with you the benefit of his preferred powder disinfectant, Stalosan F, as a tool to support your biosecurity plan. Okay, so a few logistic points. So how we are going to do that? Usually we stay together 30 to 45 minutes. So today it will be 30 minutes about. We propose to go through the presentation, right? And during the presentation, if you have any burning question, in this webinar system, you have a Q&A feature, so you can express them. At the end of the presentation, it will be your time and we will go through them. And in case we have no time to go through all your questions, we will make sure to address them, and you will find them on the Sanphar website very shortly. Okay, so right now, let's kick off the number 3, right? So purchasing and transport of animal and carcasses. Okay, so Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Harry, for the nice introduction. Welcome everyone to the third part of the webinar series on biosecurity reinforced. So Harry did a very nice recap of what was being told in the previous webinars. And in today's webinar, this one will be the first one where we'll be focusing more on some specific steps you can take to increase your biosecurity. So in the first part, we'll be talking about external biosecurity. And because it's quite an extensive topic, it's been divided in multiple smaller parts. In today's part, we'll be talking about the purchase of animals, transport, and carcass disposal. But let's start with a short recap. What exactly is external biosecurity? Well, external biosecurity focuses on the outside points of the farms and the measures that need to be taken to reduce the introduction of disease. Let us get started with the first topic of today, animal purchase. So we know that all animals that are being purchased can potentially introduce disease into the farm. So the most obvious solution to this problem is, of course, to completely avoid purchasing animals. This is actually done in a closed circuit production system. For example, on certain pig farms, all the pigs are being inseminated through artificial insemination. The piglets are born and they are raised on the farm until they're slaughtered. So no new animals are ever being purchased. But of course, this is not possible in all kinds of production systems, or in some cases you may even want to buy new animals. So for example, in cattle production, to keep up with genetic progress, you sometimes need to buy genetically superior animals from a breeding company. Or in poultry production, of course, you are kind of obliged to buy new animals every so often. But in this case, where you purchase animals, we have devised 3 guidelines that you need to take into account to increase your external biosecurity. So, what are these guidelines? The first guideline is to limit the number of source herds, because we know that each source herd can potentially have some sort of disease present in the herd. So we advise you to try and always buy from the same source or keep the amounts of sources limited. It's for the same reason that we kind of discourage buying from middlemen, such as traders or animal markets, because we know that in those places, diseases can spread between the animals before they actually are delivered onto your farm. Secondly, not all source herds are equal. So when you select your source herd, you have to make sure that they have the proper kind of documentation that ensures that the animals have a good health status. An example could be proof of vaccination schemes, a documented disease history of the animals, or also certifications for good health management protocols. Then, the second guideline is to limit the purchasing frequency. So in the previous webinar, we've seen that the fourth principle was that frequency matters and that 1,000 times a small risk can become a large risk. Well, each time you purchase animals and they are delivered onto your farm, there's a small risk that disease can be introduced. To limit this kind of risk, we advise you to increase the numbers of animals that are actually delivered per purchase. So for example, if you need 50 animals per year and you have 5 animals delivered 10 times per year, that's not as good as, for example, as purchasing 25 animals 2 times per year. However, we know that the first two guidelines are not always possible. And then the third guideline, which is to perform quarantine, becomes more important. But of course, it's best that you implement all three guidelines at all times. So the third guideline is to always perform quarantine. This will prevent disease carriers from entering the herd. So if you see this simple diagram, when you buy an animal and you don't perform quarantine, you will not notice that it carries any kind of disease. And when it enters the herd, it can potentially spread this disease very quickly through direct contact to the rest of the herd. However, when you do perform a good quarantine, you can perform tests or you can notice the clinical signs, and then the animal can be treated and you can wait until the infectious period is over, or in a case when the disease is incurable, you just sell the animal or slaughter it and it never enters the herd or enters the herd when it's cured. And then the disease will never spread to the rest of the animals. But how do you perform a good quarantine? What are some of the basic rules that a good quarantine is being used? Well, first of all, the quarantine needs to apply to all animals entering the farm. This applies to animals that have been just purchased, but also to animals that have left the farm. For example, some farmers use their animals to partake in competitions or breeding programs. And when they have left the farm premises and they come back, these animals also have to be put into quarantine because they might have contracted a disease outside of the farm. Secondly, it's important to apply an all-in, all-out management system in the quarantine pen. What does this mean? Well, this means that all animals enter the quarantine and leave the quarantine at the same time. So you're not allowed to take out an animal prematurely out of the quarantine and put it into the herd, but you're also not allowed to put in an additional animal in the quarantine once it has started. Then it needs to be cleaned and disinfected at each time it has been emptied. This will prevent that the animals will get possibly infected by microorganisms or germs that have been left behind by the previous batch of quarantined animals. And then lastly, ideally, the quarantine pen has a separate air volume. So it has its own ventilation system and its own manure pits. On farms that are completely open, so that don't have any animal housing, you can also use a separate pasture or like a separate piece of land that has been fenced. Preferably, this is as far as possible from the healthy animals, and you can use that instead. We would recommend changing this pasture each time between batches of quarantined animals, because it's of course more difficult to clean and disinfect a piece of land. How long does the quarantine need to last? Well, it needs to be sufficiently long so that there's enough time to clinically inspect the animals for any signs of disease. Examples could be a high temperature, coughing, or any kind of nervous system symptoms. Of course, not all diseases have clinical symptoms. So in those cases, we also encourage you to take samples and use the quarantine period to wait for the results to come back. If the animals haven't been vaccinated yet and you have a vaccination scheme at your farm, which you hopefully have, we recommend you to vaccinate the animals during the quarantine period. And lastly, the quarantine period is also the ideal time to allow the animals to adapt to their new environment. So to the stable temperature and to their new feed. Because we know that this adaptation period can cause stress with the animals, and stress is equal to a decreased immune system and a higher chance of spreading disease. So if the animals are already adapted in the quarantine, that will mean they're less stressed at the moment that they enter the herd. So that's about it for the purchase of animals. We'll be moving on to the second topic of today's webinar, which is transport. So transport vehicles can spread diseases between farms because, of course, any type of vehicle usually moves between multiple farms a day, and it can take the germs from farm A to farm B. So in order to prevent that, it's important that the vehicles are cleaned and disinfected before they enter your farm. The most important part is that the tires of the vehicles are being cleaned and disinfected. You can use a transport bed for this, but then you have to make sure that the fluid of the transport bed is replaced regularly, or you can use a spray to clean the tires. Then, when the vehicles are being used for transport of animals, you have to make sure that it only contains your animals. So example, when you have purchased animals, it should only contain the animals that you have purchased and not animals that are also intended for a second farm, because this brings us back to the first guideline. You always need to buy from the same source. And if it contains animals that are intended for a second farm, it's possible that they also come from a different source, and thus they may have spread infections in the vehicle itself. This is also the case for when you sell animals and they have to leave your farm, and it's important that the transport vehicle is empty and that only your animals go into the transport vehicle, because otherwise the animals that are already on the vehicle may infect animals that are present in your farm. Then the transport vehicle is only allowed in the dirty area of the farm. So this is the part of the farm that is far away from the animal housing and where less stringent rules apply. Lastly, we advise you that you make sure that the driver stays inside, because he or she may also have germs from a previous farm visit on his or her body and spread that to the animals. If the driver does leave the vehicle, for example, because you need help with the loading or unloading of the animals, it's important that you give the driver farm-specific clothing and farm-specific boots, and also that you make him or her wash his or her hands or give him gloves to ensure that no diseases are spread by the driver to the animals. That's it for transport. So then we move on to the third and last topic of today, which is, of course, carcass management. So we know that if an animal dies on a farm, it's most likely due to an infectious disease. So therefore, you should treat all carcasses on your farm as a major source for diseases, because carcasses are also the ideal environment for the microorganisms to thrive in and to multiply. So they're really an important source of infectious pressure in your animal housing. That's why it's important to regularly check the animal housing. We advise at a minimum to check your animal housing daily for dead animals, but it's even better to do this twice a day. So once early in the morning and once when you stop working, so late in the afternoon. If you spot any dead animals, it's important that you remove these carcasses as soon as possible so that the disease isn't spread to the rest of the herd or flock. Lastly, the person who manipulates the carcasses should always wear disposable gloves. Not only will this ensure that the person who's manipulating the carcasses doesn't spread the disease later on when she or he is feeding the animals, for example, but it will also be a protective factor for the person itself, because some type of diseases may also be spreaded to humans, and this will protect the person manipulating the carcasses. Then we're moving on to the carcass disposal techniques. I've listed here 5 major ways that our carcasses are being treated all over the world. There are some extra like biodigestion or chemical digestion, but these aren't really used as much, so I've left them out of this webinar. we at Ghent have sort of made a small ranking of what techniques are preferably used. So first of all, is off-site processing, whereby the carcasses are taken to, for example, a rendering plant or an industrial incinerator. This is actually our #1 advice, because in this carcass disposal technique, the carcasses are being taken away by an external company, and there is no further risk to your animals by the dead carcasses because they have been removed. And the further processing is also not an issue for you, for the farmer, because this is all being done by a third party. Then our second favorite is on-site incineration. This is when a big industrial incinerator is placed on the farm. It of course has to be certified for use of carcass disposal. And it's important that these incinerators can reach very high temperatures. So a good carcass incinerator needs to reach an internal temperature of about 850 degrees Celsius, because this will destroy all the pathogens that are in the carcass. So there is no longer any risk of a disease being spread. Then moving on, we have carcass burial. But there are a few issues with carcass burial. For example, it limits the future land use, and it takes a really long time before the carcasses are fully decomposed. So when you do apply carcass burial, we advise you to make the pits at least 4 meters deep and to make them very narrow, because that way the carcasses won't be spread over in the ground. It's also important that you put some kind of plastic liner in the pits to make sure that when the carcasses decompose and they start leaking liquids in the ground, that they don't contaminate the groundwater or any natural water sources. If they have been buried deep enough, it should be safe, because no predators will be able to dig deep enough to get access to the carcasses. But because sometimes the carcasses can get anaerobic, it can take up to years before they're fully decomposed. So we do advise you not to use this technique too often. Then moving on, we have carcass composting. Carcass composting is relatively safe and biosecure when done correctly, but it depends on the climate where it's being done. And we advise you to get some technical expertise before you get started, because constructing a pile needs to be done in a certain way so that in the first 2 weeks, you reach an internal temperature in the compost of about 60 degrees Celsius. And this is very important in the first phase, because otherwise the second phase won't go correctly and you won't actually compost the carcasses. It's also important that this is not done in an environment with a lot of natural predators, because carcass composting is done pretty superficially. So the carcasses are only covered by a layer of about 40 centimeters. So if there are a lot of predators in the neighborhood, it's possible they actually dig up the carcasses, start eating from them, and spread diseases, which is not what you want. Then lastly, we have open carcass burning. We absolutely urge you not to use this, because with open carcass burning, you throw the carcasses on a pile and light them on fire. The big problem with this, though, is that the combustion causes an air turbulence, which will further spread the pathogens in the direct environment. Secondly, the temperature is not high enough to destroy the diseases. And thirdly, it's also dangerous because you don't control the fire. So it's dangerous for yourself and for the animals that might be in the neighborhood. So don't do this. Then In this last part of the webinar, irrespective of which kind of carcass disposal technique you use, there will be some kind of need for temporarily storage of the carcasses before they are further processed. These are the criteria that you need to take into account to make a good carcass storage. First of all, of course, it needs to be fully sealed against vermin, insects, and rain so that they cannot further spread the disease from the carcasses further onto the farm. It needs to be located on a flat and permeable surface, so that way the carcass seepage cannot leak into the ground and thereby contaminate groundwater. And this will also make it easier to clean and disinfect after each use. We also advise you that the carcass storage is located in the dirty area and close to the carcass disposal. So for example, for off-site processing, the carcass storage would be located close to the public roads so that the rendering company's truck doesn't actually have to enter your farm, but can pick up the carcasses from the public roads. And lastly, and this is just the ideal because it's more difficult to implement, is that the carcass storage is cooled. Not only will this reduce any bad smells coming from the cadavers, this will also ensure that you can reduce the frequency in which the storage is emptied. Because each time, again, you empty the storage, there's a small risk that diseases are spread. And we remember from the fourth principle, frequency matters. So a cooled carcass storage reduces the frequency and thus reduces the risk of disease. That's it for my presentation. Over here, you can find my mail address and contact details if you have any further questions for after the presentation, but I will also, of course, be answering questions during the Q&A. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Andy, for your nice presentation. So let me share with you my takeaway, Andy. So live animals in the farm, so there is a long list of guidelines to go through. But the first things, we have to make sure of the health status of the animals. So this is what I get from that. Regarding the quarantine, all of us, we are going through the COVID-19 quarantine, and this is a straightforward 2 weeks. And in China, it goes up to getting you really locked down and not being able to see anyone. So your quarantine is basically as strong as what we can see. And I think that everyone in the room might definitely see what we are talking about when it comes to quarantine. What is the benefit of it? Okay, the transportation, just one word, you show us a very nice truck, you know, it looks like the best investment or operation in Asia, but we do have very different situation where animals get into the farm with a very different mode of transportation. The principle, right, should be applied. Okay, so this is very important, and when come to the carcass disposal, basically nothing gets out of the farm with pathogen, right? Unless it is done by a professional, right? So that's thank you, Andy, for all those good things regarding biosecurity inside the farm. Okay, so now let's go to Q&A. So is your time. Let's do Q&A. So we have a few questions for Plamen, and Plamen is not with us. So let me go through that, and we will come back to you as promised very shortly. So the first one, which type of disinfectant is more effective against AI and IB? Okay, so this is a very important question in Asia. And what is the main ingredient of stalosan? F. Okay, so again, Plamen will come back to you. And a last one for Plamen, what is your recommendation of quantity and frequency of application of stalosan F in the quarantine plan, if applicable, right? So we are referring to stalosan, of course. Huh? So now, Andy, we are going to bombard you with questions since you are here. So I will start by one of the questions regarding your slide number 12. Is it safe to use the hash from the incinerated carcasses as fertilizer? Andy?
That's a good question. Well, a certified on-farm incinerator should reach a temperature of at least 850 degrees Celsius. And when this is the case, all microorganisms and all infectious particles will be destroyed. So in theory, and also what we see in practice, it should be safe to use the ashes as a fertilizer. I do have an extra remark on this. For example, in the European Union, I don't know about the legislation in other pieces of the world, you do have to put the ashes that are from specified risk material. So this is from cattle older than 2 years old, because there's a small chance that they have what we call mad cow disease or bovine spongiform encephalitis. In these cases, the ashes actually have to go to a specific kind of landfill. But this is not, even though that all evidence does point that there's no risk, but this is an extra precautionary matter that has been implemented in the European Union.
Very good, Andy. So we have a question on your slide number 4. Actually, is 2 questions. One of them, I believe that you have mentioned it. So the presentation focuses on the risk of animal purchase, but what should you pay attention to when you are purchasing or introducing equipment, or what would be what should be done to when you are purchasing cement for AI, artificial insemination?
Yes, thank you for the question. So we'll start with the first question, which is about material, and we can actually break this down into 2 types of material. You, on the one hand, have, of course, the big equipment, such as a front loader. And in those cases, we, of course, recommend you to clean and disinfect it before it's being used on the farm. But because we know that very big equipment can be difficult to thoroughly clean and disinfect, we also actually advise an additional kind of quarantine period for the equipment. So equipment can be what we call in academic terms can be a fomite. This is when an inanimate object carries microorganisms and spreads disease to other living organisms. So in order to prevent this transmission by fomite, it's important that you clean and disinfect and, if possible, use a quarantine period for the big equipment. Now, for smaller equipment, for example, a shovel, that can be perfectly cleaned and disinfected before it's introduced. So there's no additional quarantine period needed. But then there's also, of course, electronical type of devices, such as a phone. In those cases, because they're not really difficult, they're difficult to clean and disinfect because you can destroy the electronic equipment. In those cases, there's a pass-through system. So this is like a small box that connects the outside part of the farm with the inside part of the farm, where you can put in your cell phone. And those are equipped, of course, with some kind of ultraviolet light, which destroys the superficial microorganisms. But of course, these types of systems are very expensive. And the cheaper alternative would, of course, just to have a locker of some kind where the cell phones are put into, and you cannot use your cell phone when you're at the farm. Then the second question, which concerns the purchase of semen, which we see in fully closed production system types, or also just on regular farms, because it's a good way to increase production. You need to make sure that the semen comes from a certified artificial insemination station, where they perform testing to ensure that there's no sexually transmitted diseases. And when the semen is delivered, it's important that you have a cooled box or refrigerator waiting for the person who delivers it, so that he or she doesn't have to enter the farm, but can just temporarily store it in that fridge. This will ensure that the semen remains of good quality. This will also not reduce a person that's coming onto your farm, and who does reduce the risk. Thank you. That was my answer.
Thank you, Andy. So on the slide 11, we have a question, but actually the person brought a suggestion to it, and we believe that this is the right one. So besides physical checking of animal housing, we assume that any dead animals should be removed and the reason of the death rapidly identified. So I'm sure that, Andy, you confirm that, right?
Yes, indeed. Of course, it's very important that the veterinarian or another qualified person performs the necropsy as soon as possible. So not only is this important to determine the cause of death, so that the right kind of treatments can be performed for the other animals, or the right kind of measures can be performed for the other animals, it can also make the difference between, for example, an infectious death and a non-infectious death. Because, for example, we know that young piglets sometimes can die because of stomach ulceration, but this is not always an infectious cause. For example, if the feed that is being used for the piglets has a certain kind of density, it can cause stomach ulceration and thus cause the piglets to die. But in this case, it's important to know the cause of that, because then you know that you have to change the feed for the piglets, and that it's not necessarily a biosecurity problem, but really it's more of a feed problem.
Thank you, Andy. So that was all for the program today. So thank you again for your time, and see you next month. So we have a rendezvous with Joran de Wolf again. And Joran will bring us to the external biosecurity part 2, and going through the feed, water surrounding of the farm, how to keep the rodent and wild animal away from the farm, and other point of attention at the farm. So thank you. Bye now. Thank you. Bye.